Harsh sunlight glares across a flat expanse of pale sandstone. A researcher kneels, placing a metal scale bar next to two parallel rows of deep indentations. The rock is scored. These are fossilized footprints, preserved roughly 305 million years ago during the Carboniferous period. We do not have the complete adult head or body of the creature that made them. We only have the mathematics of its movement. The stride is uniform. But that math is unyielding. To leave a track 50 centimeters wide, the animal, an arthropod called Arthropleura, must have reached a length on the order of a small car. It is an impossible size by modern biological rules. This is a synthesis across multiple sites and studies. How did the collapse of an alien, hyper-oxygenated world force the evolution of our ancestors? The sheer weight of geological time is required to make this transformation. Wood must be buried rapidly. It must be sealed away from the air beneath layers of sediment and water before it can completely rot. Over tens of millions of years, the intense pressure of the earth above squeezes the water and gases out of the plant matter. The physical structure of the tree is annihilated. What remains is a dense concentration of pure carbon. We can sometimes see the faint, ghostly impressions of ancient bark and leaves still locked within the shiny surface of the cold. It is a perfect, silent archive. We can't tell the exact global temperature of the ancient world from a single core. The layers are too compressed. What it does support is a massive accumulation of undecayed carbon. The sheer volume of this black rock is staggering. It is found in massive, continuous seams across modern North America, Europe, and parts of Asia. This points to an environment fundamentally different from our own. It was a world where plant matter piled up in unimaginable quantities without rotting away. That unchecked accumulation did not just build rock. It actively changed the chemistry of the entire planet. To understand what this world felt like, we look to geochemical modeling. A diagram plotting ancient atmospheric gases reveals a drastic shift across deep time. The vertical axis tracks the percentage of oxygen. The horizontal axis tracks millions of years. For most of Earth's history, the line remains relatively stable. But as we enter the Carboniferous, the curve climbs sharply. We measure the isotopes of carbon and sulfur locked in ancient marine shales and coal beds to build this curve. The math is simple but profound. When living plants photosynthesize, they take in carbon dioxide and release oxygen. Normally, when those plants die and rot, the decay process consumes that oxygen and releases the carbon back into the air. It is a balanced loop. But in this ancient world, the loop was broken. Millions of tons of carbon were buried in the deep swamps. They were locked in the mud instead of rotting. Because the carbon was buried, the oxygen it would have consumed during decay was left behind in the atmosphere. The air changed. Geochemical models, like the GeoCarb self model, track this massive imbalance. These models suggest that atmospheric oxygen peaked as high as 35%. This is a number that remains fiercely debated among geochemists. But it is structurally supported by the biology that survived in the rock. At 35%, it is an oxygen concentration roughly 1.5 times what we breathe today. This air would be toxic to modern human lungs over long periods. SRC01, Journal article. 1998, Carboniferous period, about 305 million years ago. The air is thick. It carries the heavy scent of damp soil, stagnant water, and decaying vegetation. This is a reconstruction of the vast rainforests that stretched across the equator on the supercontinent of Euramerica. We are standing in the deep, waterlogged interior of a swamp. The humidity is absolute. There are no flowers here. There is no grass. The concept of a modern broadleaf forest does not exist yet. The canopy above is built entirely by primitive plants called lycophytes. These are towering, spore-bearing trees. Specifically a genus called lepidodendron. They form an unbroken green roof that filters the sunlight into narrow, hazy beams. They rise 40 meters into the pale sky. Their trunks are alien. They are not covered in normal, woody bark. Instead, they are wrapped in overlapping, diamond-shaped scales. These scales are the physical scars left behind where stiff, needle-like leaves grew directly out of the trunk and fell away as the tree grew taller. Lepidodendron does not have deep taproots to anchor itself in the soft mud. It relies on a shallow, branching network of roots that spread out like a star across the surface of the swamp. It is a fragile architecture. The trees grow fast. They reach their massive heights in a fraction of the time a modern hardwood requires. They reproduce by dropping millions of spores into the water. It is a constant, invisible rain. Lacking deep structural support, they eventually collapse into the mud. They cast long, broken shadows over the dark, stagnant water below. The swamp is a chaotic maze of living pillars and dead, fallen logs. The dense canopy traps the humidity. The air is permanently still, thick with the constant buzz of unseen life. Then, a shadow cuts through the columns of light. It moves with sharp, mechanical precision. A massive silhouette banks above the water. It swings beating with a low, thrumming sound, and lands lightly on a submerged lycopsid root. This is Meganeura. It is an apex aerial insectivore. We know its size from delicate, highly detailed impressions left in fine-grained mudstones. The rock preserves the exact venation of its wings. When we measure those fossilized impressions, the true scale of the animal comes into focus. It is an insect with a wingspan on the order of a modern eagle. Its wings stretch nearly 75 centimeters from tip to tip. This is direct evidence of a scale that breaks every rule of modern biology. SRC01, Journal article. 1998. The sheer size of Meganeura commands the space around it. Its large, compound eyes scan the stagnant pools. Its four wings rest flat, catching the scattered light. Today, an insect this large would suffocate in minutes. The mechanics of modern arthropod respiration simply do not allow for a creature of this mass to pull enough oxygen from our current atmosphere. So how did this giant take flight? The answer is locked in the physics of its breathing tubes, and the toxic, hyper-oxygenated air it was built to breathe. Carboniferous period, about 305 million years ago. The swamp is alive. Meganeura launches from the root. It rises into the humid air. The 75 centimeter wingspan generates a low, mechanical hum that cuts through the stillness of the deep forest. The fossilized wing impressions found in the coal measures of Europe give us exact dimensions. They show a network of thick, supportive veins capable of bearing significant aerodynamic stress. It is a massive animal. We reconstruct it flying with absolute control, navigating the dense pillars of the scaly lycopsid trees. Yet, by the laws of modern biology, it should be dead. SRC01, Journal article. 1998, Present Day, Insect Biomechanics Analysis. A bright monitor illuminates a darkened laboratory. A researcher manipulates a three-dimensional digital model on the screen. The model is a micro-CT scan of a modern insect. The scanner has mapped the internal anatomy of the specimen, isolating a complex, branching network of empty tubes. This is the tracheal system. Insects do not have lungs. They lack a closed circulatory system to pump oxygen-rich blood from a central respiratory organ out to their distant flight muscles. Instead, they breathe through these hollow tubes. The network opens to the outside air through tiny, valve-like pores along the insect's abdomen, called spiracles. Air flows in. It travels down the branching tracheae, getting narrower and narrower, delivering oxygen directly to the cellular tissue. It is a largely passive system. It relies heavily on simple gas diffusion. This anatomical architecture creates a strict biological ceiling. Physics limits bugs. As an insect evolves to be larger, its internal volume increases at a much faster rate than its surface area. To supply oxygen to a larger, deeper core, the tracheal tubes must become wider. They must stretch further into the body. Eventually, pure geometry wins. If a modern insect grew to the size of Meganeura in today's atmosphere, its tubes would need to be so wide that they would leave no physical room for organs, a stomach, or flight muscles. The insect hits a hard mathematical size limit. Biomechanical models of insect tracheal systems demonstrate that flight at this massive scale requires hyperoxygenation. By running gas diffusion simulations, researchers can test ancient atmospheres. If oxygen levels in the air are pushed higher, the gas diffuses faster and penetrates deeper. The tracheal tubes can remain narrow while still delivering vastly more energy. The biological brakes are released. The animal can grow. SRC01, Journal article. 1998. We can't tell the exact color or mating behavior of Meganeura from these wing impressions. What it does support is an aerial predator constrained entirely by atmospheric chemistry. It is a slave to the air. The rocks preserve its physical structure. The geochemical models explain its impossible scale. Carboniferous period, about 305 million years ago. The air is loaded with fuel, with oxygen levels pushing toward 35%. Meganeura operates with terrifying efficiency. Its four wings are structurally distinct from the wings of modern birds or bats. They operate completely independently. The front pair can sweep forward and tilt while the back pair beats downward. This allows for instantaneous, erratic changes in direction. It can hover in place. It can dart backward. It can pivot in a fraction of a second to intercept movement. It hunts on the wing. The large, compound eyes wrap around the front of its head, providing near spherical vision. It tracks the erratic movement of a smaller insect against the dark, spore-choked canopy. It accelerates. The reconstructed attack is swift and brutal. Spined legs stretch forward to form a cage, snatching the prey out of the air. Strong mandibles crush the target in mid-flight. It is an aerial master. The hyperoxygenated atmosphere sustains its massive flight muscles, which burn energy at a tremendous rate. Heat radiates from its thorax as it circles back over the dark water. Meganeura rules the open spaces between the scaly trunks. Nothing challenges it in the canopy. The smaller flying insects, early ancestors of modern mayflies and roaches, scatter as its shadow passes over them. It is the absolute peak of aerial evolution for its time, perfectly matched to a sky rich in oxygen and thick with humidity. It is an organism pushed to the absolute edge of its physiological constraints by a unique atmosphere, but the canopy is only half of this world. Down below, the dark, flooded forest floor is covered in decaying wood, deep mud, and an endless rain of plant spores. The ground is a tangled obstacle course of fallen lycopsid trunks. Meganeura stays above it. If the sky was ruled by a giant aerial predator, what controlled the ground? Carboniferous period, about 305 million years ago. A low vibration shivers through the wet, decaying plant matter on the forest floor. The mud here is dark and deep. It is choked with rotting lycopsid trunks and a continuous, invisible dusting of spores. A massive shape pushes slowly through the debris. It brushes against the scaly bark of a fallen tree. It is low, wide, and heavily armored. Dozens of legs move in a rippling, synchronized wave, churning the soft sediment as it passes. This is a reconstruction of Arthropleura. It is an arthropod of incomprehensible scale. Present day, fossil trackway site. Harsh sunlight glares off a vast, flat expanse of pale sandstone. A researcher kneels on the rock, leaning over a distinct, repetitive pattern etched into the stone surface. Two parallel rows of deep, rhythmic indentations run in a sweeping curve across the slab. The researcher places a metal scale bar directly beside the track. A camera clicks. This is the process of photogrammetry. Dozens of high-resolution images are taken from different angles to build a precise, three-dimensional mathematical model of the rock. These are fossilized footprints, officially classified as the trace fossil diplechnites. They are direct evidence of movement, The photogrammetry model isolates the geometry of the track. The distance between the left and right rows of footprints is constant. The stride length between individual leg strikes is uniform. Trackways assigned to diplitchnites indicate an arthropod of approximately 50 cm in width. By applying the known biological proportions of modern, related millipedes and centipedes to that width, we calculate the total body size. The math reveals a devastating scale. To possess a 50 cm width, the animal making these tracks must have reached roughly 2.5 meters in length. It is an invertebrate on the order of a small car. SRC04, Journal article. 2021. We can't tell the exact shape of an adult Arthropleura head from partial carapaces. What it does support is a heavily armored, multi-segmented body. We have found isolated plates of its thick exoskeleton in fossil beds across Europe and North America. They show thick, overlapping segments built to defend a massive internal volume. But the head of a full-grown adult has never been found. It remains a ghost. Without the head. Early interpretations leaned into the terrifying scale of the animal. Pop culture and early paleo art frequently cast Arthropleura as a hyper-aggressive, venomous centipede, a giant killer hunting early amphibians in the mud. The sheer size demanded an apex predator narrative. The truth, however, is locked inside its waste. Present-day, fossil preparation lab. A researcher carefully positions a thin, polished slice of rock under the lens of a high-powered microscope. The rock is a coprolite, fossilized dung. When sliced thin enough, light can pass directly through the rock matrix, illuminating the microscopic structures trapped inside. Under the lens, a chaotic jumble of organic material is revealed. There are no shattered bones here. There are no fragments of insect wings or crushed amphibian scales. Instead, the slide is packed with thousands of tiny, spherical shapes. These are like apsid spores. They are mixed with fragmented, pulverized pieces of primitive plant tissue. The chemistry of the gut has fossilized. SRC04, Journal article. 2021. The microscope reveals a biological reality that instantly demotes Arthropleura from apex predator to giant herbivore. It was essentially a heavily armored, blind cow. The massive animal dragged its 2.5-meter body through the mud, slowly vacuuming up the rotting wood and spore-laden debris that carpeted the swamp floor. It didn't need to be fast. It didn't need venom. Its sheer mass and thick exoskeleton made it untouchable to most predators. It was a gentle giant, perfectly adapted to process the massive overproduction of plant matter that defined the Carboniferous forest. Carboniferous period, about 305 million years ago. Arthropleura continues its slow march, leaving a deep, 50-centimeter wide rut in the wet mud. It ignores the smaller, faster movement nearby. A sleek, low shape rests almost invisibly among the damp leaf litter. This is Pulminus scorpius. It is the true ambush predator of the ground layer. Preserved in the East Kirkton limestone of Scotland. Complete body fossils reveal an architecture identical to modern scorpions. Simply scaled up to a massive 70 centimeters. SRC, East Kirkton synthesis. We reconstruct Pulminus scorpius waiting in total stillness. The swamp is dark near the ground. Sunlight barely penetrates the thick canopy of lycopsid trees. In this gloom, vision is useless. Instead, we infer the giant scorpion relied on sensory hairs covering its legs and specialized comb-like organs on its underside. Just like modern scorpions, it hunted entirely by detecting the minute vibrations of movement in the soft mud. It is a highly tuned, reactive machine. A small, early roach scuttles too close. The scorpion strikes. The massive pincers snap shut, dragging the prey toward the powerful, curved stinger arching over its back. The ground is dangerous. But it is also fundamentally strange. Arthropleura can graze infinitely because the plant matter here does not behave the way modern forests do. It just keeps piling up. How is this swamp generating so much dead, Rotting wood that a 2.5-meter arthropod can eat endlessly without exhausting the supply. Carboniferous period, about 305 million years ago. A massive lycopsid tree, 40 meters tall and weakened by a shallow root system, groans and finally gives way. It crashes into the flooded swamp, sending up a geyser of dark, spore-choked water. The scaly trunk settles into the muck. Here, in a modern forest, a complex army of organisms would begin the work of decomposition. Beetles would bore through the bark. Fungi would send microscopic threads deep into the wood, breaking down the tough structural molecules. Bacteria would finish the job, slowly dissolving the tree back into carbon dioxide and soil. But in this ancient swamp, the trunk simply rests in the water. Decades pass. The tree does not dissolve. Another lycopsid falls across it. Then another. The dead wood piles up in massive, tangled heaps, undecayed, slowly sinking under its own weight into the deep mud. Present-day paleoecology synthesis. A diagram maps the chemical structure of lignin. Lignin is the tough, complex organic polymer that gives plant cell walls their rigidity. It makes wood hard. One long-held hypothesis argues that the trees of the Carboniferous didn't rot because the fungi of the era simply hadn't evolved the necessary enzymes to digest lignin. According to this theory, a biological lignin lag occurred. Plants invented strong wood, but the decomposers were left behind in the evolutionary arms race. So, the dead trees just accumulated in massive, inert piles for millions of years. This idea dominated textbooks for decades. But recent syntheses argue for a different, strictly environmental cause, anoxic burial. SRC02, Journal article. 2016. The competing hypothesis relies on geology, not fungal genetics. The Carboniferous swamps were vast, flat, and deeply flooded. When a tree fell into this stagnant water, it sank into an environment utterly devoid of oxygen. Even modern, highly evolved fungi cannot break down wood in deep, anoxic water. They require oxygen to metabolize lignin. The swamps were simply too wet, too deep, and too stagnant to allow any decomposer to survive. The environment drowned its own dead. This anoxic burial locked the trees away, perfectly preserving the carbon within their trunks. Present-day fossil preparation lab. A researcher holds a small, rounded rock. It is roughly the size and shape of a flattened potato. This is a siderite nodule from the Marzorn Creek deposits in Illinois. The rock is hard, dense ironstone. The researcher places the nodule into a container of water, completely submerging it. The container is moved into a deep freeze. Once frozen solid, the container is taken out and allowed to thaw. This cycle of freezing and thawing is repeated dozens of times over several weeks. The water expands as ice, finding microscopic planes of weakness inside the rock. Eventually, a sharp crack echoes through the lab. The nodule splits perfectly in half. The freeze-thaw method reveals a stunning, delicate fossil inside. It is not bone. It is the soft, fleshy impression of an organism that should not exist. A long, soft body ends in a bizarre, spade-like tail. A rigid proboscis extends from the front, terminating in a claw-like mouth filled with tiny teeth. Two eyes are set on long, rigid stalks projecting far out from the sides of the body. This is Tullimonstrum, the Tully monster. We can't tell exactly where Tullimonstrum fits on the tree of life. What it does support is a bizarre, highly specialized ecosystem preserved by the exact anoxic mud that stopped the trees from rotting. The Tully monster had no hard shell, no bones, and no tough exoskeleton. In any normal environment, it would have rotted to nothing in days. But the anoxic, iron-rich mud of the Marzorn Creek estuary entombed it instantly. The lack of oxygen halted decay. The iron precipitated out of the water, forming a hard siderite nodule around the soft body, perfectly preserving its alien shape for 300 million years. SRC05, Journal article. 2016, the preservation of the Tully monster and the accumulation of the coal are the result of the exact same process. Burying the wood buries the carbon. The swamp is literally sucking the heat out of the global climate. By taking millions of tons of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and locking it in the mud, the Carboniferous forest was steadily weakening the greenhouse effect. The planet was slowly freezing itself. The oxygen is still rising. The carbon is still burying. The climate is beginning to wobble under the massive strain of this biological imbalance. What happens when a drying swamp, packed with dead wood, hits 35% oxygen? Carboniferous period, about 305 million years ago. A sudden, violent crack of lightning shatters the heavy silence of the swamp. It strikes the upper branches of a massive lycopsid tree. Normally, in a waterlogged, humid forest, the fire would smolder and die. The wet bark and damp air would smother the heat. But the air here is fundamentally different. With oxygen pushing toward 35%, the physics of combustion change entirely. The wet wood ignites. The reconstructed fire does not just survive, it accelerates. Flames crown across the scaly canopy, leaping from tree to tree with terrifying speed. The heat vaporizes the moisture in the leaves instantly. The fire roars through the wet swamp, leaving behind a charred, blackened wasteland of standing, dead trunks. Present-day, geological core repository. A microscope focuses tightly on a thin section of the coal core sample. The black rock is not perfectly uniform. Embedded deep within the compressed carbon matrix is a distinct, brittle band of dull, fibrous material. It looks exactly like the burnt remains from a modern campfire. This is inertinite. It is fossilized charcoal. Inertinite layers within the coal beds confirm high-intensity wildfires occurred frequently. The sheer volume of inertinite found globally in Carboniferous coal seams indicates that these forests burned often and burned hot. Despite the pervasive water, wet swamps can burn if the oxygen concentration is high enough to force the combustion. SRC, coal measures taphonomy synthesis. We can't tell the exact day or season a specific forest burned from a band of inertinite. What it does support is a global regime of intense, recurring fire driven by oxygen. The fires reset the swamps. They cleared out the tangled, dead wood and allowed the fast-growing lycopsids to colonize the ash. It was a violent, cyclical rhythm of growth, burial, and fire. But a much larger rhythm was beginning to force a change. Diagram, evidence-based. A global map of the Carboniferous Earth pulls back to reveal the southern hemisphere. The massive supercontinent of Gondwana dominates the bottom of the globe. At the South Pole, a vast, blinding white sheet of ice expands outward. As the Carboniferous forests buried more and more carbon, the global temperature steadily dropped. The ice caps grew. As water was locked up in the expanding glaciers, the global sea level plummeted. The deep oceans retreated from the shallow continental shelves. Present-day, stratigraphic mapping. A vertical column graphic charts the rock layers found above the coal seams. This is a cyclotham. It is a repeating, rhythmic sequence of specific rock types. At the bottom is the thick, black layer of coal, the compressed remains of the wet swamp. Directly above the coal lies a layer of grey marine shale, mud deposited by a shallow sea. And above the shale sits a layer of pale, coarse sandstone, rock formed from dry riverbeds and exposed land. This pattern, coal, shale, sandstone, repeats over and over again. Stacked like a massive barcode, the cyclothams act as a geological metronome. They record the violent oscillations of the global climate. When the southern ice caps melted during warmer phases, the sea level rose rapidly, drowning the swamps under shallow, grey marine water. When the ice caps froze and expanded again, the sea level dropped, exposing the land to dry winds and cutting off the water the swamps needed to survive. The climate was yo-yoing wildly. The stable, continuous rainforest was beginning to crack, as the sea retreated and the swamps shrank into isolated pockets. The creatures that depended entirely on the wet mud were suddenly trapped. The giant arthropods, the delicate spore-bearing trees, and the amphibians that ruled the shallows were facing a fundamentally drying world. As the swamps shrank, what happens to the animals tied to the water? Carboniferous period, about 305 million years ago. An Archaeops rests in the shallow, muddy water at the edge of a shrinking pond. It is a massive, heavily built amphibian. Its wide, flat skull rests just below the surface, eyes staring blankly through the murky water. We reconstruct it as an ambush predator, perfectly adapted to lunging at primitive fish and smaller amphibians that swim too close. But Archaeops is geographically trapped. It is a creature of the water, like modern frogs and salamanders. Its reproductive cycle is entirely dependent on the pond. It must return to the water to lay its eggs. Those eggs are soft, gelatinous, and prone to rapid dehydration if exposed to dry air. Archaeops cannot simply walk away across the dry land. It is tethered to the swamp. As the dry cycles of the cyclothms intensify and the ponds vanish, Archaeops has nowhere to go. Present-day, Joggins Fossil Cliffs. A stark, grey cliff face rises abruptly from a rocky beach in Nova Scotia. The harsh coastal wind whips against the stone. A researcher climbs carefully across the loose shale, examining the sheer vertical face of the cliff. Embedded directly within the horizontal rock strata are distinct, cylindrical pillars of stone. They stand perfectly upright, interrupting the flat layers around them. These are fossilized tree casts. They are the petrified remains of hollowed-out lycopsid stumps that stood dead and rotting while sediment piled up around them. The researcher uses a small, stiff brush to carefully clean away the debris from the base of one of the broken casts. Inside the hollow cylinder, a delicate, jumbled mass of tiny, articulated bones is revealed. They do not belong to an amphibian. They are the remains of small, lizard-like creatures with long limbs and narrow skulls. Skeletons preserved in negative relief within upright lycopsid casts confirm these tetrapods fell into hollow stumps. They were hunting insects or seeking shelter inside the rotting wood. They slipped, fell to the bottom of the deep, vertical traps, and starved. SRC, Joggins Fossil Cliffs Synthesis. We can't tell exactly what Hylonomus was hunting when it fell. What it does support is a creature adapted to the dry interior of a rotting log, away from the open water. Hylonomus is small, measuring only about 20 centimeters long. It has scales to prevent its skin from drying out. But its true evolutionary breakthrough is completely invisible in the fossilized bones. We know it existed not from direct fossilization of the soft tissue, but through phylogenetic bracketing. By mapping the evolutionary tree of life, comparing the amphibians that came before it with the reptiles that came after, we can pinpoint exactly what Hylonomus represents. Diagram, evidence-based. A cross-section of a complex, multi-layered egg appears. This is the amniote egg. It is arguably the most important biological innovation in the history of land animals. The egg is wrapped in a tough, leathery, semi-permeable membrane. Inside, a series of specialized sacs suspend the developing embryo in a pool of fluid. It provides oxygen, manages waste, and prevents the delicate tissue from drying out. The amniote egg wraps a tiny ocean inside a membrane. It is a portable pond. For the first time, a vertebrate animal does not need to return to the water to reproduce. It can lay its eggs in the dry soil, inside a hollow stump, or beneath the leaf litter. Hylonomus is one of the earliest known amniotes. It is a basal reptile. While the massive amphibians like Archaeops were tethered to the shrinking swamps, Hylonomus was quietly adapting to the dry spaces in between. They were ready for dry land. Just-in-time Carboniferous period, about 299 million years ago. The mud is cracked and hard. The thick, humid air has thinned. The constant, invisible rain of lycopsid spores still falls from the scaly canopy above. But it is useless. The spores land on dry soil. Without a layer of standing water, the spores cannot germinate. The reproductive cycle of the giant trees is broken. The towering lepidodendrons stand like silent monuments in a dying forest. They cannot replace themselves. When they fall, the space remains empty. Present-day paleoecology synthesis. A diagram maps the shifting distribution of plant life across Euramerica. The data is pulled from thousands of fossilized pollen and spore samples extracted from the rock layers. The visual is stark. The massive, continuous green band that spanned the equator begins to fracture. The solid block of rainforest shatters into dozens of isolated, shrinking islands. A shift from lycopsid-dominated to tree-fern-dominated flora correlates with the collapse of the rainforest biome. The fast-growing, water-dependent trees are replaced by smaller, hardier ferns that can tolerate the dry periods. SRC 03, Journal article. 2010. The Carboniferous rainforest collapse was not a sudden meteor strike. It was a slow, grinding fracture. The global cooling, driven by millions of years of carbon burial, forced the sea levels down and the climate into severe, dry cycles. The continuous canopy broke. And with it, the highly specialized ecosystem it supported simply fell apart. We reconstruct Meganeura navigating a much brighter, open sky. The dense pillars are gone. But the giant insect is doomed. Its sheer size requires hyper-oxygenation. And as the massive forests die, the oxygen levels slowly begin to drop. More critically, we infer Meganeura's life cycle was fundamentally tied to the water. Like modern dragonflies, it likely laid its eggs in ponds, with larval nymphs developing underwater. As the deep swamps dry up, the nymphs have nowhere to survive. The adults fly over cracked mud, searching for water that no longer exists. Arthropleura is similarly trapped. The 2.5-meter giant drags its armored body across the dry ground. The endless supply of soft, rotting wood and wet spores is gone. The deep, protective mud it used to navigate the forest floor has hardened into stone. Its sheer mass, once its greatest defense, is now a fatal metabolic burden. The giants suffocate and starve. We can't tell if a specific weather event killed the last Meganeura. What it does support is a systemic collapse where hyper-specialized giants ran out of habitat. The Carboniferous created organisms pushed to the absolute edge of physical limits. When the environment that supported those limits vanished, the organisms were erased. But the collapse of one world is the foundation of the next. Hylonomus and the early amniotes survived the transition. They are small. They require far less oxygen. Their scaly skin retains moisture. And crucially, their eggs can survive in the dry dirt. While the amphibians are trapped in the vanishing puddles, the early reptiles simply walk across the dry, arid gaps between the dying forest islands. The collapse of the rainforest cleared the board. It destroyed the dominant amphibians and arthropods, leaving the dry, open world entirely to the amniotes. This is the moment the ancestors of modern reptiles, dinosaurs, and mammals finally took the Earth. Present-day, geological core repository. A modern cockroach scuttles across the stainless steel table, pausing briefly on the black surface of the coal core. The cockroach is small, efficient, and requires very little to survive. It is the ultimate generalist. It is a direct, miniaturized descendant of the insects that survived the collapse. The black rock beneath it is the ghost of the giants. We pull this rock from the earth to burn it. In doing so, we are reversing 60 million years of carbon burial in 2 centuries. The ancient atmosphere, the exact carbon that froze the planet and shattered the first rainforest, is being released back into our own. The Carboniferous was a world built by a biological imbalance. It was a world of impossible scale, preserved only by the mud that killed it. We know its sweat, rotting heart intimately. But the dry uplands, the silent, unfossilized spaces where the early reptiles truly learned to conquer the land, remain hidden in the dark.